Footsoldier, we have Deonteleologist for this debate. Footsoldier's taken the position that metametaphysics is not a separate field of inquiry to metaphysics, and so the second meta is redundant. Deonteleologist has taken the opposition. As always, when we base upon who concedes, we don't get a vocal concession from either participant. We'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can vote on who you think performed better overall in the debate. I believe you guys agreed on 45 minutes with light moderation. And with that, you guys can get started.
Right, so yeah, we want to cap it at 45 minutes, but if it is a quicker debate than that, then that's also good too. I don't feel like I have much of a positive case to establish with this particular debate proposition, other than the fact that I feel when we're going to be talking about something which is meta, there's going to be a possibility of recursion of meta and higher level stuff. When we talk about cognition, we can say, oh, well, I, I've just looked at a blue flower. And so I'm seeing a blue flower. That my cognitive state right now is blue flowerness or something like this, right? In my mind's eye, I'm seeing a blue flower. But then if we start talking about me thinking about, like discuss the thought of a blue flower and what it meant to have that thought or something like this, we can start having metacognition, talking about thoughts that we've had, talking about cognition, and we can analyze the cognition and try and discuss the meaning of that, and then we could have a next layer of recursion of this meta principle and have like some meta cognition, be like, oh well, me thinking about discussing blue flowers and what it means to thinking about blue flowers, and we can have another level of thinking about blue flowers, and then so on, and ad infinitum. You can just sort of have this recursion of meta. But I wouldn't say that each level of meta is its own separate, unique, distinct level of distinct field of inquiry. Right?
Soldier,
You
you
could.
cut out.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Um, I, the last thing I heard you say was, I wouldn't say.
Right. So I wouldn't say that each level of meta-ness is its own independent, distinct field of inquiry. It's all within the same type of inquiry. Either you're talking about the thought itself, or you're talking about the meaning of what it is to be thoughts, or something like this. And we can call this some sort of meta realm. But once you're already talking about the meta, then there's no separate field of inquiry to talk about some additional level of meta. It's all meta, right? At that point, if it's meta, it's still just meta. There's otherwise we're going to need metaphysics and metaphysics and meta and so on, and it's unjustified, because the second that we're talking meta, we're already in the realm of metaphysics, to the point where actually, even although this is just an anecdote, but it can sort of support the point more. Wikipedia had a stub called Metametaphysics, and they decided on Wikipedia, you can actually see the notes on the metaphysics page, they decided it doesn't make sense having its own page, metaphysics, so they merged the metametaphysics, so they merged it into metaphysics, and they just had a quick sort of account of what some people think are metametaphysics within the metaphysics. But everyone was sort of agreeing, if you read the discussion of why they merged it, everyone was agreeing and saying, oh well, yeah, metaphysics just seems to be a part of the inquiry of metaphysics as a field, right? It's not a separate, unrelated field. It's not a separate, or not necessarily unrelated, but it's not an entirely separate field. It's the same field. It's just asking different questions within the same field. So we can ask different questions within science, but we're not going to say that it's not science, it's some separate thing. So it's all happily within the realm of metaphysics to talk about any subsequent recursion of the meta level. So that's what I'd say there. And if Deon, if you want to establish a case why we can't see metaphysics just as something which is in fact metaphysics, I'm not saying that we can't say things like metametaphysics or metaphysics, but it's just redundant. Maybe it's sort of highlighting the fact that we're talking about sort of higher levels of meta recursion, but in terms of a field of inquiry, it's redundant and unnecessary. So I was wondering if you had a response to that, Deon.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, totally reasonable position. I just want to clarify a few things before I make my positive case. So it seems to me that you're totally fine with saying something like, um, we have ethics and we also have meta ethics. Um, but if we were to ask like meta ethical questions, we wouldn't need to posit meta ethics. That would just fall squarely within meta ethics.
Right.
And then in the broader sense, we could talk about meta ethics as a sort of subfield of ethics or moral philosophy more generally. And if we were being more specific, we might say that meta ethics is really something like meta normative ethics or something like meta. Um, do you know what I mean? Because like
Yeah, we
we
generally have within the proposition was physics, but we can also just apply the same thing to ethics. So in ethics we generally have three different levels. We have the applied ethics, the normative ethics, and the meta ethics, right? And if you're gonna start to ask, oh, should we have meta ethics or something like this, then that's not a meta ethical question. That's simply a meta
right.
ethical question.
And what defines the or what meta refers to in these disciplinary contexts is something like methodological questions about whatever follows meta,
Well, it's
generally speaking.
meta doesn't
And
mean methodological. It means beyond or
well, it means
transcendent
beyond,
of.
right? Yeah, but I mean, in terms of our enumeration of philosophical subdisciplines. When we say we're doing meta ethics, that includes general methodological questions about how we do ethics, including the meaning of moral terms, uh, the objectivity or relativity of moral values, these sorts of things, right? Moral epistemology.
Right.
So, if you grant that, I think um, I have a pretty clear case to make. And so, metaphysics, the reason it's called metaphysics has nothing to do with its relationship to physics. Metaphysics is called metaphysics because of the labeling of Aristotle's works. You can find all sorts of accounts of this story, but it goes something like when people were giving names to um, Aristotle's text, like the metaphysics didn't have its own name, but it was the thing that came after Aristotle's physics in the copy of the work of Aristotle's works at the time. So they called it the one after physics, and meta can sometimes be used as after, and so it became metaphysics. And what Aristotle was doing in the metaphysics, um, what he I don't think he used the term that would correspond to metaphysics as we use it now, but the the phrase that he used to describe what he was doing in that work was well, he used a sort of a contrast to make it clear. He said that like biology was the study of beings qua living beings or qua living beings. Um, and I forgot what the other example was. Maybe physics is the study of beings qua physical entities, or not beings, sorry, but being. Um, and then metaphysics, as it came to be known, is the study of being qua being, right? Or qua being. Be just being, not through any particular lens of like chemistry, physics, biology, uh, the earth sciences, or mathematics, or anything like that, but just being insofar as it is being, right? Being in the most general sense possible. And so that has nothing to do necessarily with physics. Aristotle himself probably wouldn't have had any problem accommodating a kind of view that sees metaphysics as metaphysics in a more literal sense, because Aristotle was a pretty thoroughgoing empiricist and sort of a materialist in some sense, and probably didn't think that there was anything above and beyond the material world the way that Plato did. And so physis, right, which becomes physics, just refers to nature or all of the natural world. And so you could see metaphysics for Aristotle as actually related to physics in the way that metaethics is related to ethics. But the way that we do metaphysics today, it's not connected to physics necessarily. We're not necessarily looking at things through the lens of physics, but we're doing something more like the study of ultimate reality, where it's not taken for granted that reality is exhausted by the physical. And so it might be the case that there are abstract entities, and there's the metaphysics of abstract entities. There's the metaphysics of particulars and universals. There are the metaphysics of works of art. There are all sorts of metaphysical questions where we're not necessarily asking about, we're not necessarily doing, to put it shortly, it's not necessarily the case as we do metaphysics today that metaphysics is to physics as metaethics is to ethics. And so I'll just give an example of what I think a metaphysical question would be. So just replace the metaphysical with, for instance, ontological, right? So ontological questions are questions about what there is, questions about being, sometimes asked or put as questions about existence. So, for instance, Quine, in his very famous "On What There Is" paper from I think 1948, I have a quote. He says that he begins by posing what he calls the ontological problem. Peter Van Inwagen later called the ontological question, and that's the question, what is there? And Quine said that this question can be answered with one word, everything, and, quote, everyone will accept this as true. However, this is merely to say that there is what there is. So I think it's pretty clear that we can say that Quine here has a meta-ontological assumption, where we could not quite substitute the word meta-ontological for meta-metaphysical, but because I think the ontological would be a subset of the metaphysical, and thus the meta-ontological would be a subset of the meta-metaphysical. But Quine's meta-ontological assumption is that to say everything is, that statement or sentence is identical in meaning to the statement, there is what there is, or there is whatever there is. But we might not think this, right? A lot of thinkers have treated this as an open question. For instance, Meinong thought that in the set of all things, some things were round and square. But Meinong wouldn't say that there is such a thing as what is round and square, right? The round square does not exist, nor does it even subsist for Meinong. So these sorts of questions in ontology or in metaphysics are analogous to questions about the meaning of moral terms in metaethics, right? So if we ask, what's the relationship between being and existing? You could see that as pretty much the same sort of methodological question or semantic question as questions about the relationship between the concept of or what the relationship that is between moral motivation and moral judgments or something like that, right? It's questions about the meanings of moral terms in the ethical case, and here it's questions about the meanings of ontological terms like being, existence, subsistence, etc.
Right.
So that's the basics of my case.
Right. Well, I would say that was an interesting look at the etymology of the word metaphysics, but I'm sort of a bit skeptical there because I feel like what you've done is looked at the great ancient Greek origins, and then we've leapfrogged to Quine, right, in the 20th century, but we're forgetting the fact that during the Enlightenment period, there was a different usage of the word metaphysics, which is slightly different from its modern and ancient usage, right? So when um, when philosophers like Hegel and Kant and all the rest in the Enlightenment era and Hume were doing their work, they considered themselves metaphysicians, right? So they considered what they were doing metaphysics. So when they were discussing philosophy, that was metaphysics. Um, and because you had science, and science as a whole discipline would include obviously biologists, chemists, people like that, maybe even alchemists back then, and stuff like this. But then um, metaphysics basically just meant philosophy. So if you were a metaphysician, it meant that you were a philosopher, because the word philosophy or philosopher wasn't in popular usage back then, if I'm correct, in the Enlightenment era. People weren't philosophers, they were metaphysicians. And so when we were asking metaphysical questions back then, they were just metaphysical questions because they were in the realm of philosophy. But because metaphysics was just simply for the branch of science, which was philosophy, what we call philosophy nowadays. So there's been a shift in meaning. So if we're going to look at historic shifts in meaning, I would just say, well, metaphysics and metaethics are all just part of metaphysics because metaphysics is just the discipline of philosophy, basically. But if we're going to take a modern usage and separate it out into um, into language, epistemology, and metaphysics, then yeah, we can have a three tier approach. And I'm just going to say everything that you think is meta just fits into metaphysics. And just because you see that Quine was maybe asking higher order questions about ontology, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessary to create a new category of thinking, which we call metaphysics, even if it is asking meta level questions about metaphysical inquiry itself, because I can just make an analogy to bring it back to how we would think about this in other subjects. So we've got theatre, people acting on stage, and there's this concept of there being a fourth wall. And the fourth wall, or the first, second, and third walls are sort of like the left, right, and back of the theatre, or as the audience is looking, like with the back of the behind the actors, right? What the audience are looking at, right? That's the first, second, and third walls. The fourth wall is the imaginary wall which separates the audience from the actors, and the actors go about their business on the stage, as if there was the wall there that they couldn't see through, but the audience can see through. But then, when the actors actually address the audience and look into the audience and talk to the audience directly, all of a sudden, we call that breaking the fourth wall, because that's now a case of meta theatre. It's a meta theatrical event in that case. Whereas if they're just doing theatre normally, then it's theatre, and when they break the fourth wall, that's an example of a meta theatrical event. But if they were to then start talking about them breaking the fourth wall, that's not a meta theatrical event. That's just simply a meta theatrical event. Still, you're just having fun with meta theatrics, right? You're just having fun breaking the fourth wall in a more clever way. If you start talking about the fact that you are breaking the fourth wall, and then some other actor talks about you talking about the fact that you're now breaking the fourth wall, right? And there's these recursions, and they could have a conversation. Oh, what did he say? Oh, well, he was just talking about him just talking about breaking the fourth wall, which is currently doing. And so there could be this recursion of breaking the fourth wall, right? But that's not meta theatre. That's just meta theatrical events occurring in the same way as we have with.
But this is my view. This is my view. Is that uh, I'm not positing anything above metaphysics. I'm just saying metaphysics is not to physics as metaethics is to ethics. So this metaphysics sounds like I'm sort of I'm dooming myself to this infinite regress, when really the problem is just that the meta in metaphysics is misleading. So if it's easier to see the analogy if we say something like ontology and meta-ontology. Once again, with respect to the point about etymology of the term, right? I was only invoking the etymology of the term to show that the relationship between metaphysics and physics is not the same or is not analogous to the relationship between metaethics and ethics. Whether philosophers used metaphysics as a synonym for philosophy in the days of Kant and Hegel is neither here nor there for the purposes of this discussion, because we're talking about the categories that we use now and the sense of the term that we use now. And when we talk about metaphysics, we're not necessarily talking about the physical at all, right? So with your analogy, I think I'm not sure how useful it is to talk about theater here, but I'm not saying that there's any meta theatrical event. You would subsume anything higher than the second order of meta theater, right? Anything that you would instead call meta theater is just lumped in with meta theater, right? All of the questions that we want to ask and the ostensive infinite regress is actually just it sits neatly within the meta level, right? So you
Right.
have the
So,
first order.
to interrupt, we are in full agreement there then, right? So the only thing in dispute right now is to clarify the etymology, or the usage of the word, because that's where the disagreement currently is. So we can just focus the conversation on that.
Sure.
So we have, you're saying metaphysics actually has a misleading meta in it, and it's actually the study of ontology or something.
Well,
Um,
I would say ontology is a subset of it. And so
right.
it just shows that at least we can have a branch of metaphysics called meta-ontology, where there's only one meta, and it makes it clear what the relationship is.
Right. Well, I'm just going to argue that that's not the case. That there, like, where you're saying that the parallels between metaethics and metaphysics don't hold, because metaphysics is sort of like saying ethics, and then so metaethics is like saying metaphysics. I'm just going to deny that that's the case, because what happened, as I explained in the Enlightenment era, was that there was people doing science, and Darwin and these people, they're all doing science, and Hegel and Kant and Hume and these people were also doing a type of science, but it's not really science. It's asking questions about the science, right? So it was a meta level on the science. So whereas science back
And
then,
that's essentially like epistemology or philosophy of science.
like science back then was basically physics, right? And then
Well, it was
metaphysics,
called physics, right? It was
right?
called
And
physics,
then
but it's not what we would identify as physics today.
no, exactly.
Physics back then was all the natural sciences.
Exactly. So physics was all the natural sciences, right? And then metaphysics was this meta level when it doesn't fit into natural science. Science, we're talking about um, modes of being and like the doubting the external world and questions like this, like Berkeleyan conceptualizations of the world and this type of thing, and Leibnizian a priori knowledge and all these types of things which go over and beyond the natural world, right? So that's what um, was the meta there, because we're going over and beyond the natural world. But as you've rightly said, the terms are now used differently, because someone who was a physician in the Enlightenment era nowadays isn't necessarily a physicist or a physician, because you say physician nowadays, you think medical doctor, and if you say uh, physics professional, you think someone who has a lot to do with, I don't know, like gravity, researching gravity, all this sort of stuff. I don't know, but you know what I mean. But the problem is, since the Enlightenment, this is where our little issue is coming in, is because since the Enlightenment, the usage of the words has changed. So now what we've got, instead of saying physics in a philosophical sense or in a scientific sense nowadays, what we have are different categories. We have epistemology and we have language and other disciplines,
It,
right? And
how I don't think it was people would say back in the day that epistemology and the philosophy of language were subdisciplines of physics.
it sort of, in a way, it was. It was.
Uh,
To,
I
you,
I've I mean every time that I've seen physics used in a philosophical context, especially around the Enlightenment era, it's specifically to do with like the external world. And so questions about the philosophy of language and about epistemology, like those had perhaps implications for physics, but I have never seen anyone's categorize them um, as subdisciplines of physics or areas of physics one could specialize in or something like that.
you just got to look at the one of the most important, or arguably the most important, philosophical text in the field of ethics. It's called Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, right, by Kant. So it's like,
Yeah,
well, the
very familiar with that.
groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. So he's not saying groundwork for the meta ethics or something. He's talking about metaphysics, meaning the philosophy of morality, right? So what
But
he's
not
saying,
but
right?
but not just the philosophy of morality, because in Kant's groundwork, he's giving the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, and in there he's giving you the conditions of morality that affect all rational beings. And then when he gives the metaphysics of morals, that those are the application of those general principles to the specific particular case of human rational agents. And then towards the end, he talks about how um, actual, like, practical um, tools for moral education and the sort of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of morality would have to come of human morality would have to come in a work of anthropology and not a metaphysics of morals, because the metaphysics for Kant signifies an a priori component. But because and there should be no mixture of um, empirical considerations. But doing the anthropology of morals, that would give you much more substantive, which Kant himself actually did, and where you can see a lot of, racist and sexist shit that he believed was actually very important for proper moral education. Uh, this applied specifically to the human context, he still thought of as philosophy, but it wasn't a metaphysics of morals because it was no longer dealing with the a priori and it was focusing on the empirical. And so he called that anthropology, but it wasn't metaphysics.
Right, but we're already like if you're gonna grant this distinction already in the Enlightenment age, then you're already granting the fact that there was a existing conception of the meta to point to something which was already one level of meta removed from the underlying field of inquiry. So in that case, you would be self-defeating your own point,
No,
right?
I don't think so because, again, the use of metaphysics here has nothing to do with physics.
Right, but you're saying that there was that you were literally just saying how we were discussing a priori knowledge of morality, and that was labeled as the meta part, and whereas the non-meta part was the application and the anthropology, right, which is compatible with what I said a minute ago. And so we've already got a level of meta in there. So now,
Yes, but again, the metaphysics, right? For you to claim that there is no metaphysics, right, relies on there being this relationship between the metaphysics and between metaphysics and physics in the way that there's a relationship between metaethics and ethics.
yeah, but
And in Kant,
I'm
there is no such
demonstrating.
distinction.
Yeah, no, I'm showing you how that is the case, right? Because the back in, or if we want to shift it to modern conceptualization of the language, because this is going to be most important. I feel like although my point holds in the Enlightenment era, because metaphysics was seen more broadly as a study of philosophical inquiry as opposed to more scientific inquiry, and anthropology would be a subset of scientific inquiry. So although my point holds exactly in the Enlightenment era, let's just move it into the modern age. So when we're discussing, because we've only got a few minutes left anyway, when we're discussing metaphysics nowadays, we're talking about stuff which goes above and beyond um, science in terms of scientific inquiry. We're already talking about a meta level, and I don't think anyone's going to say, well, metaphysics actually isn't a meta level. Metaphysics is just talking about, oh, well, this pair over here or that apple over there. No, they aren't metaphysical questions in the first place. The type of questions we get in metaphysics are already of the meta kind, so we already have a meta in there.
What do you mean they're already of a meta kind?
So metaphysics
Like,
is talking about
so, I mean, so physics, for instance, could ask a question like, what is time and how does time work? But equally, metaphysics could ask that question.
physics could say, look, what is how do we conceptualize um, time, like with atomic clocks, is an atomic clock more accurate or something like this? We can talk about all that sort of stuff, but then when we want to say talk about, should we be asking questions about time, because is time something which is actually an intuition of the human mind and not something which actually exists, and stuff at this meta level of it, that is metaphysics, and that's what we do put in the category that's already a meta level. So to have a metaphysics would be saying, oh well, should we ask questions about, should we ask questions about asking questions about time, right? That would be
No,
the metaphysics.
not necessarily. I mean, so that could be one way that you could have a metaphysics. But again, I already gave you what I think is the most plausible application of what a metaphysical question would look like, and that's a meta ontological question that's received a lot of discussion since Van den Wagen's paper in, I think it was 1989, called meta ontology.
Right,
And
but
that's
but
the
there's
question. What does it mean to ask what is there, or what does it mean to say that something exists? So I guess I would ask you this question. Are you saying that when we're asking that question, uh, we're doing nothing we're not asking questions about how we do metaphysics, or how does metaphysical inquiry work. We're just doing metaphysics.
Right, because if it was otherwise, we would get into the infinite regress, because then we'd have to have a separate discipline to inquire like how we do, or is it good to have the field of
No,
metametaphysics, right?
wait, no.
Right,
I mean, we
because
already agreed that
yeah,
we
yeah, and we
wouldn't
already
need that.
agreed. So
We
therefore, if
wouldn't
we
need
already
that.
agreed with
No,
that,
we wouldn't need that.
right, we
Because
wouldn't need that. So
having
in the case of metaphysics, any inquiry about meta ontology, when the ontology is seen as within the realm of metaphysics already, that's just folding back into metaphysics anyway. So we can talk about meta ontology, but we can't talk about metaphysics. We can talk about metaphysics and we can talk about meta ontology, but we can't talk about metaphysics. And if you want to say
But
that,
meta ontology is a it is a subdiscipline of metaphysics, because metaphysics includes ontology. So to do meta ontology is to do metaphysics.
to do meta
To do a
ontology
kind of
is to do
metaphysics.
metaphysics.
No, to do ontology is to do ontological inquiry is a subspecies of metaphysical inquiry. So you add the higher order, and meta-ontological inquiry is metaphysical inquiry, is a
So
kind of metaphysical inquiry.
so if I'm to do meta ontological inquiry, I need metaphysics.
No. Again, that's not the case, because once you have the meta to the discipline that's asking the direct questions, like ontology is asking questions about being, meta-ontology is asking questions about how we are asking these questions about being, just like metaethics is asking about how we're asking these questions about normativity and the good life and what makes actions right and wrong, etc. Right? So but if you want to ask questions about that, you don't need metaethics in the same way that if you want to ask questions about meta-ontology, you don't need meta-ontology. You do meta-ontology. The fact that there's two metas in metaphysics is just a consequence of the etymology of the word.
Yeah, we're just going to have to disagree here then, because if you were to agree with the etymology of metaphysics, you would concede the point. But it's just now a quibble over the
What
etymology.
do you mean I would concede the point? What, I don't know what you're how is that supposed to
You
work?
would concede the proposition.
No.
So
Because there's not the relationship
if this
between
whole
metaphysics and
hold on,
physics that there
if
is
this
between metaethics and ethics.
if this whole conversation was about metaethics, you wouldn't have argued the prop, or you would argue it in a different way, or in this conversation you would have conceded the prop, right?
Say it again. If this
If
was about
this,
metaethics, or if this was
yeah,
about metaethics.
yeah, if we were talking about metaethics, right, you would concede the prop right now.
Yes, but again, the crucial
Right.
distinction.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm saying then we're arguing about the etymology of metaphysics, right? And
It's not
so,
just the etymology, it's the semantic content of it.
right, and the semantic content as used today of metaphysics is encapsulating everything which is meta uh, to reality, or meta to the observation, is the first principle of inquiry before we can actually get to the physical world. So if we're going
It's
to
not
ask
about
abstract questions,
wait a minute. It's not meta questions about reality. It's questions about reality, right? Now, if you assume that all there is to reality is the physical, then you can say that metaphysics is a matter of meta questions about reality. But you can't simply assume that all there is to reality is the physical.
well, look, even right, I am a transcendental idealist, but asking metaphysical questions, even discussing the separation between the noumenal and the phenomenological, right? This is already in metaphysics, right? If I'm talking about physics, then that is what is in the world as perceivable to me already, right? But if I'm going to start speculating about the ultimate nature of reality and stuff like this, then that is metaphysics. To then say, oh, well, should
Yeah,
we
the
question
ultimate
that or
nature
something?
of
That's just
reality.
having a
But
metaphysical
not
conversation.
you don't. So again, the ultimate nature of reality, that is the subject matter of metaphysics, right?
Right, and then so asking questions about the ultimate nature of reality is also metaphysics, right? We're already meta. We're
No,
already we're
okay.
no,
So
you're
you've repeated this point enough times, like,
right,
but
but it's this
that point is
you're
only
just
going to work
disagreeing.
if
You're just
that
disagreeing
point.
without any real
No, no,
reason
I'm
to
not just
disagree.
disagreeing. No, I've given you the reason several times. The
Yeah, because
reason is
you're just substituting the word metaphysics for ontology so that you
no,
can
I'm not.
squeeze
I'm
in
using
another
that as
meta.
an example.
Yeah,
Using
no,
that
but
as an
I can do
example.
that with anything, right? So I can
No,
I can substitute the word metaphysics for apple. And then because apple doesn't have any metas in front of it, I can say meta apple. So now we've got meta apple. I can say, well, meta
no, it's
apple
all
is now
about the
synonymous with
relationship.
orange.
It's no, 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 no.
Meta apple is now
This is pure
synonymous with
sophistry, foot
orange. So
soldier.
now I can put now I can do
I
meta orange,
actually
and then we
thought you
get
were
meta
better than
apple.
this. This is
Dude,
pure sophistry.
no, this is exactly what you're doing.
It's not at all what I'm doing.
It is
It's
exactly
about
what you're
it's
doing.
not about no, no. It's not about the symbol itself. It's about the relationship between the word and the component of the word, right? So in metaethics and ethics, the relationship is clear. Ethics asks questions about what it is good and bad to do, what is right and wrong, etc. Metaethics asks questions about what we, among other things, what we mean when we ask, is X good or is X bad? Is X right? Is X wrong? Metaphysics, right, or ontology, ask questions about what there is, among other things, right? About
Well, no,
reality. And then
look, you're
metaphysics asks questions about what we mean when we say, does something exist? Does it not exist? Is there an X? Is there not an X? What is existence? What is subsistence? What are the relationship between these? What do
you've
we mean
pulled a
when
bit
we're
of an odd
saying
move.
these things?
You've pulled a bit of an odd move here. If we're going to make basic analogies like this, we would say, look, normative ethics is what is right and wrong. Meta ethics is what do we mean when we say something's wrong. Um, we could say epistemology is knowing that the apple is green, and metaphysics is saying what do we mean when we say that the apple is green. Right? It's the same. Right?
Where did you
It's
get the
analogous.
relationship between epistemology and metaphysics? That the relationship there would be something like meta epistemology.
Well, that's just a branch of metaphysics, right? So we can just roll it all into
Epistemology is a
metaphysics.
branch of metaphysics?
If we're going to have meta epistemology questions, that's just going to be some sort of like meta. Well, I guess you could have meta epistemology as a separate discipline, but we're going to ask questions of when we're asking questions of a meta kind. That's all metaphysics, right? But now you want to say no. We can have questions of a higher order than metaphysics. Well, I'm just saying you've already agreed that if we're going to have meta, we just meta, we roll it into the meta. But you're saying the only reason why we do that is because the meta that's already there isn't redundant because it's almost like just a leftover relic of the past, and the etymology of the word produces the meta, but actually it's not already meta. Well, it is already meta, and I can show you how it's already meta, and I've just given you an analogy of how it could be meta, right? And to say that it's not meta already would be to say that metaphysics would be discussing things in the world just talking about the being, oh, an apple exists or something. No, that's not what we're talking about with metaphysics. We're talking about what does it mean for an apple to exist? Does the apple
No,
exist in
no,
reality, or is it
no. There's
weird?
so much work on the metaphysics of objects, right? There's questions like, do chairs exist, right? That's metaphysics. Like, are there chairs or are there not chairs? Are these like, are there really just micro configurations of particles, right?
Right,
Questions
it's
about
asking
mereology.
questions.
The
It's asking like so.
question,
If I say a
do
chair
chairs
exists,
exist? That's a
that's not.
metaphysical question. That's an
If I say
ontological question.
if I
Now,
point
if
to a
I
chair,
ask, what does it
dude,
mean to say as a
stop
chair exists?
interrupting.
What are the
You,
truth conditions for existence? That is a metaphysical question or a meta ontological question.
dude, if I point to a chair and say this chair exists, that isn't metaphysics.
Absolutely, it is.
So you're saying
You
pointing
haven't,
at a
you just
chair and
haven't
saying
read up on analytic metaphysics, the metaphysics of objects. This is a huge topic right now. All
right,
sorts of metaphysicians working on this.
right. So you're saying that making the proposition there is a chair in this room is a metaphysical proposition.
Yeah,
Well, you're wrong.
Okay, you can say that. All right. Yeah, fair enough. No, I mean, I think it's clear where I stand and clear where Footsoldier stands. He can give one if he wants.
Sure, yeah, I'll give a quick closing statement. Yeah, so you agree that there need not be any additional levels of meta. Once we've got a meta discipline, we don't need to have a meta discipline. We just roll it all into one meta. But you say the reason why we don't do that with metaphysics is because metaphysics doesn't actually contain an element of the meta already, because the meta was just left over from the previous usage of the word, so to say. I'm arguing that that's not the case, because if we walk into a room and say, oh, there's a chair in here, that's not a metaphysical question or a metaphysical proposition, whether there's a chair there. That's not metaphysics, right? When we talk about metaphysics, we're saying, what does it mean that there is a chair here? Does a chair exist actually
No.
in some sort of actual material sense? What about composition of the chair? What about these questions of composition and questions of ultimate reality? That is what we mean by metaphysics. And so it's already the meta level. So metaphysics, if he already agree with me that we'd roll all of the meta into the meta, right? So we don't need these redundant regressions of meta, but he's just not agreeing with metaphysics already having the meta element, and I would just suggest that it does. I can put a screenshot. People on Wikipedia are rolling in metaphysics into metaphysics because it's redundant, and people just saying exactly the same thing that I'm saying. It's a fringe opinion to say that metaphysics is not part of metaphysics and it's a separate field of inquiry. But we're just going to have to disagree on that because Deon disagrees.
It's a fringe opinion perhaps on Wikipedia, but you can find multiple books published by Cambridge University Press on metaphysics.
Right. I'm not disagreeing that there's books on metaphysics, but I'm just personally saying it's redundant, and it seems to be a fringe opinion that it's not. But I guess
Also,
that
just
we'll have
love
to
to
leave it
see
there.
I would love to see a physicist claim that they can give a physical analysis of whether chairs exist.
Well, you're saying okay, we're gonna have to end the debate there.
Yeah, let's call it off. I mean, we could always have a round two if you guys want, or just continue it in serious.
Sure, I just think that it's wrong to point at a chair and say, oh, there's a chair in here, and that's a metaphysical proposition. It just seems odd.